Everyone in the village of Chaya knew Noria. You didn't even need to hear her name. Just the sharp whip-like crack of her voice was enough. Whether it was gossip, insults, or jokes she had no business telling, Noria's mouth was faster than the wind and twice as biting, and of course she was untouched. "Virgin girl," they whispered, like it was some holy badge she wore, as if it made her words more innocent. But Noria was no saint. She didn't believe in keeping quiet. She didn't believe in old ways. And most of all, she didn't believe in fear. Not the fear that kept other girls inside when the sun dipped too low. Not the fear that made elders pour libations to trees they swore had spirits. And not the fear that made her grandmother Mbuyadine tie charms at every window of their clay hut. "Grandma," she scoffed once, hands on her hips, "you tie all these cowrie shells and feathers like they're going to stop some demon from walking through the door." Mbuyadine only squinted at her, one grey eye fogged like clouded glass. "They've stopped worse," Noria laughed. "Old woman, you just love your stories, spirits here, spirits there, maybe they just don't like you." But that was the thing with Noria. Her voice had no brakes, and her pride had no ceiling. She'd mocked the hunter who once returned bloodied and crying, called the head priest a lazy old fraud. She even dared to walk through the Tamba Grove barefoot, alone, just to prove there was no such thing as sacred land. But stories, they don't wait forever. They listen, they follow, and sometimes they bite. It was during the nights of black, winds when the sky went cloudless, and yet the wind howled like it was mourning something ancient. That's when things started to shift. First it was the crows, not flying, just sitting, lining up on roofs, all facing Noria's house, silent, watching. Then the fires wouldn't light in their compound, not in the hearth, not even when soaked in dry palm oil. People whispered about the signs, but Noria, as usual, ran her mouth. Maybe the gods are finally tired of failing, so they're trying new tricks. That's when he came. No one saw where he entered from. No horse, no footsteps. Just a man in red, standing at the edge of the market, staring at Noria while she laughed with two other girls. His skin was dark as charcoal, smooth and flawless. His eyes golden, like a cat, or something not quite human. The girls noticed him first. "Noria, look." She turned mid-joke and locked eyes with him. Something inside her paused, just for a second. Then she snorted. "Who's that?" "A new beggar with expensive taste." But the man didn't speak, didn't move. Just kept watching her, like he could see through her skin, past her heart, into something older and deeper. That night, Noria dreamed of thorns wrapping around her tongue, pulling it until it bled. When she woke, her pillow was damp and not with sweat, Mbuyadine noticed. "The wind's shifting, child. You've laughed too loud at things that don't forget." Noria didn't reply. For once she was quiet, but silence was only the beginning. The next morning, when she stepped outside, the red man was sitting on the well wall. He tilted his head slowly, then spoke, voice smooth like honey boiling. "You speak too much for someone who knows so little." Noria, caught off guard, flinched. Then she scoffed. "You stalking me now?" The man smiled, but it wasn't kind. "No, I'm hunting." And just like that he vanished, blinked out like fog in sunlight. She ran back into the hut, chest pounding. But what she didn't know was, he hadn't vanished. He'd only stepped into her shadow, and from now on he wouldn't be leaving. That night, the moon refused to rise. The sky was open, but not a single star shone over Chaya. And in her grandmother's hut, Noria sat on the edge of her mat, arms crossed tight, sweat pooling at the back of her neck, even though the wind outside was cold enough to bite. Mbuyadine hadn't said a word since sundown. She just hummed, low, rough notes, like something you'd hear in a funeral procession. The smell of burnt herbs choked the air, and white chalk symbols had been drawn in, a circle around Noria's mat. "This is foolish," Noria finally snapped. "You think some drawings and smoke will keep him away?" Mbuyadine didn't answer at first. Her foggy eye blinked once, slow as a lizard's. "No," she whispered. "This is not to keep him away." Noria frowned. "Then what's it for?" "The old woman tapped her chest. "To keep you in." Noria laughed once, bitter. "I'm not the one being hunted." But inside she wasn't so sure. Her mouth had always been her weapon. But now every word felt like a loaded trap, like she didn't know who was listening or what they'd do if they didn't like it. And her dreams kept bleeding into waking life, thorns in her throat, shadows crawling under her skin. Eyes, always, those golden eyes, watching her even when she blinked. 3 nights passed, and every night she woke to something missing. First, it was her voice. She opened her mouth to insult the rain for leaking through the thatch roof, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, her throat strained, but the world stayed silent. Then it was her reflection, the old cracked mirror that leaned by the cooking stones. Her face had disappeared from it. Her body was there, clear as day, but her head was nothing but black fog. Mbuyadeen covered the mirror with a cloth that same hour. "You've been marked," she muttered. "The red one doesn't kill with blade or poison. He eats pride, strips the self, leaves nothing." Noria wanted to shout, fight, curse, but no voice came, not even a whisper. So she ran. Out of the hut, past the goats and mango trees, through the narrow dusty trails between huts where women gossiped and children played, past the market where men sharpened knives and bartered yams. So everyone watched her. No one stopped her. When she reached the grove where the trees grew so thick the light turned green, she finally fell to her knees, gasping. Silent. He was already there. The man in red stood beside the stream, barefoot, his crimson cloak trailing in the mud. His eyes shimmered in the dark. "You've run a long way," he said, "but your mouth is still moving." Noria tried to speak, tried to scream, but nothing came out. He stepped closer. "Your tongue was never yours to begin with. It belonged to your ancestors, and now it belongs to me." She backed away, crawling on hands and knees, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped animal. "You mocked the gods, mocked the dead, mocked the living. You thought your words made you powerful." He crouched, nose inches from hers. "But words carry weight, and yours are dripping in blood." She shook her head violently, tears rising in her throat, trying to beg, trying to apologize, but still. Silence. He touched her forehead with one blackened fingertip. It burned. "Now," he whispered, "you will learn the value of quiet." And then everything shattered, not the world but her mind. Voices poured in, all the ones she had insulted, all the ones she had mocked. Their pain, their shame, their anger, it rushed through her like boiling water. She felt every sting, every tear, every humiliation she had ever caused, tenfold, screaming inside her head, and she couldn't stop it, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The man stood and turned. "You will walk the earth with no voice, no reflection, and no rest, not until you understand the cost of your pride." Then he was gone, and Noria? She stayed on her knees by the stream, eyes wide, mouth open, but not a single word came out. By the time dawn kissed the village of Chaya, Noria had dragged herself back home, barefoot, filthy, trembling. But what startled Mbuyadene wasn't her silence. It was her eyes. They were no longer just brown. No. They shimmered now with a faint, haunted gold, a reflection of his mark. The same gold that once pierced her soul under the moonlight, now danced beneath her lashes. "You looked into his soul," the old woman muttered. "And he left fingerprints in yours." Noria tried to speak. Again, nothing. Her lips moved, but no voice followed. Mbuyadene didn't try to fix it this time. No herbs, no chants, no spirits summoned. She just sat, and for the first time in her life, Noria was forced to listen. That week something shifted in the village. People began having nightmares, not just bad dreams, but visions. Crying in their sleep, screaming. Some couldn't wake for hours. Others walked the streets mumbling things that made no sense, like, "Her tongue is a bridge, her shame is a curse." One girl from the next. Compound sliced off a chunk of her own hair and threw it into the fire, sobbing, "She cursed me with her lies." The air was thick with unease, and every eye sooner or later turned to Noria. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't even raise her head. But it didn't matter. Even her silence was loud now. People avoided her like a ghost. Mothers snatched their children closer when she passed. The fruit seller who once flirted with her spat in her direction. The same men who used to smirk when she called them fools now whispered prayers when she walked by. But the worst came at the village well. It was the only place Noria still went, the only space where the man in red had first spoken to her, as if she hoped he might return and undo what he'd done. One morning, she reached the well, just as a group of young women arrived. They froze when they saw her. One, a girl named Lena, scoffed. "Oh, look, the mighty virgin, the one who thought she was better than all of us. What's wrong? Cat got your tongue, or something darker?" The others giggled nervously. Noria didn't react. Just filled her gourd with water, hands trembling. But Lena wasn't done. "You used to call me desperate," she hissed. "Used to laugh when I was crying over Kibu cheating. But now, even the trees don't want to hear you speak." She stepped closer, too close. "Say something now, Noria. Call me a fool again. Say it, I dare you." Noria's chest heaved, her hands clenched, her lips parted, and a scream burst from Lena's mouth, not Noria's. She fell to the ground, clutching her. Head howling like fire was burning through her skull. The others scattered in panic. Lena rolled in the dirt, eyes wide and foam at her lips, sobbing, make her stop talking inside me." But Noria hadn't said a word. That evening, Mbuya Dane didn't light the lantern. She just stared at her granddaughter in the dim shadows of the hut. "You're not cursed, child," she said softly. "You're becoming something else, something that balances what was broken." Noria looked up, eyes glassy, throat raw. "The man in red didn't silence you. He redirected you. Now your words come out through others, through their guilt, their fear, their pain." She didn't know whether to cry or scream. All her life her mouth had been her sword. Now, it was a mirror, a wound, a weapon turned inward, and worse, she could feel him, still, in the corners of her dreams, in the spaces between her thoughts, waiting, watching. She knew now what he had meant when he said, "You will walk the earth with no voice until you understand." But what did he want her to understand? Forgiveness? Punishment? Or was this just the beginning of something darker? You're deep in now, and things are turning twisted. What happens when a girl's silence starts speaking louder than her voice ever did? In Part 4, Noria begins to understand her new power, but it might be a lesson taught in pain. Noria stopped trying to speak. She learned to listen. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was crowded, full of whispers that didn't come from mouths. Regrets curled around her thoughts like smoke. Whenever someone got too close, their guilt came with them. She could hear them, not with her ears but somewhere behind her forehead. It started with Lena's screaming at the well, then with the market boy who ran when she passed, mumbling, "She knows I lied about that goat." Even Mbuya Dene began avoiding her eyes, her old voice softer, warier. Noria had become a walking confession booth, a mirror the village couldn't bear to face, and they hated her for it. They didn't need her to talk anymore. Her silence was enough to make people flinch, because somehow, deep down, they all knew what she was now. Not quite a girl, not quite a ghost, but something in between, and still Toreki hadn't come back. The man in red. He'd promised she would walk until she understood. But how long would that take? How many hearts did she have to break before she earned her voice again? Or maybe that was never the point. Maybe this was the voice. One night she stood at the edge of the Tamba Grove again, the same place where it all started. But this time, she wasn't there to challenge anything. She came barefoot, quiet, empty. She sat beneath the giant fig tree where offerings were once made, now dry, forgotten, the bowl cracked. She laid her hand on the roots and thought, what am I now? That's when the wind changed. Soft, cold, and full of voices. Not hers, not the village's, but older, deeper, rooted in the land itself. She didn't move, just listened. 1,000 memories whispered past her ears. Warriors begging forgiveness, women casting curses in the night, blood spilled over pride, tongues split by lies. The land remembered all of it, and it remembered her too. Then she felt a presence, not behind her, inside her, a warm, burning pulse, like fire licking the inside of her chest, and a voice, smooth and cruel, coiled through her ribs. "You begin to see," it said. "But you are still far from learning." Her body froze, not with fear, with knowing. He was in her. The man in red hadn't left her. He had rooted himself like a parasite, feeding off every moment she resisted, every time she hated the silence. And now she didn't hate it anymore. She embraced it. That night she walked through the village, past closed doors, past children crying in their sleep, past whispers that turned into screams when she stopped walking and simply stared. In front of Kibu's hut, the boy who once slapped Lena and called her worthless, she paused. He opened the door, face pale as chalk. "What? What do you want?" he stammered, backing into his doorway. Noria didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes widened. I'm sorry. He dropped to his knees, sobbing, hands pressed to his ears like her silence was roaring. "I was drunk, okay? I didn't mean to hit her. I thought she cheated. His words turned into screams, then begging. Then a howl that made neighbors peek from behind curtains. Noria turned and walked away. Behind her he slammed the door and wailed like something was peeling his soul open. She didn't enjoy it. But she didn't pity him either. The silence had given her something more powerful than noise. It had given her truth, and now she wondered, did the man in red curse her? Or did he crown her? Because the girl who once ran her mouth was now the girl the village couldn't shut out, even in their own minds. The elders called an emergency council at the shrine the next morning. They didn't speak her name. They didn't have to. They sat in a tight circle beneath the fig tree's shadow, sweating, whispering like children in trouble, passing cola. Nuts with shaking fingers. Smoke from burning roots swirled up into the morning sun, but no amount of ash could clear what they felt in their bones. "She is not natural," one elder muttered. "A spirit rides her now." "Maybe it was always riding her," another replied. "We were too distracted by her mouth to notice the silence inside her soul. And Mbuyadene was there too, wrapped in her old cloth, bones stiff, eyes low. "This is not a spirit's doing," she finally said. Her voice was tired. "It's ours." They stared. "You say she was cursed," she continued. "But who let her grow with no restraint? Who laughed when she mocked the weak? Who clapped when she cut people down with words? No one spoke. She was our mirror, and now the mirror's broken, and it's cutting." Still, they wanted to act. A priest was called in from Ogbo town, someone known for pulling darkness from possessed souls. A man in white robes with black cowrie beads on his wrists and goat's blood under his fingernails. He said nothing when he entered Chaya. He only asked, "Where is the mouth that speaks no more?" They pointed, and that night they came for her, not with violence, with ritual. 7 women in red cloth, 3 men with drums, and the priest in white stood outside her hut, chanting. She didn't resist, didn't flinch, just stood at the doorway, eyes burning with golden threads of silence. They tied her arms gently, walked her barefoot to the shrine, placed her in the circle. And the priest began. He called to ancestors, to winds, to old gods with forgotten names. Smoke rose thick, the sky blackened too fast, and Noria sat calm, unmoving, even when ash dusted her lashes. Then the priest leaned close, sweat pouring. "Speak," he whispered. "Speak and release. The spirit riding you." She looked into his eyes, and didn't speak. Instead, he screamed. The priest howled like fire had been poured into his chest, stumbling back from her like he'd touched a lightning bolt. The crowd gasped. Mbuyadene stood halfway before falling to her knees. The priest gripped his head, writhing, muttering names that didn't belong to him. "They're in me, all of them. Regrets and lies." He vomited on the floor, a thick black bile that stank of rot and old sin. Noria didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared, calm, empty, whole. The ritual failed. No spirit was pulled, because she wasn't. Possessed, she had become the thing they feared, a vessel, a reckoning, the voice of silence itself. That night, no one slept. The village was quiet, not from peace, but from terror. Every whisper carried her name now. Every footstep was light, as if scared it might awaken something in her. And still she said nothing, but she watched from doorways, from shadows, from the corners of their dreams. People began to confess their sins without her ever coming near. A man stood outside the temple and admitted he stole from the poor bowl. For 5 years. A girl confessed to pushing her friend into the river years ago, pretending it was an accident. Her mother sobbed that she lied about her husband beating her just to shame his new wife, and Noria only listened. She never lifted a finger. But she didn't have to, because now they were punishing themselves, and deep inside her, the man in red whispered again, "You are learning. But will you ever want your voice back?" She didn't answer, not with words. But somewhere inside she smiled, because for the first time, she liked the silence. It had been 33 days since Noria last spoke. The village didn't count by the moon anymore. They counted in days since she fell silent. The market grew quieter. No music, no arguments. Laughter died quickly. People avoided talking unless it was necessary, as if every word might be judged by something they couldn't see, or worse, by someone who no longer needed to speak to be heard. Children who once mocked her now crossed themselves with palm ash when she passed. One boy even knelt and begged her to forgive him for breaking her clay water jar a year ago. She hadn't even known it was him. The power was growing. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was pull. People felt her presence like wind before a storm. Conversations stopped when she entered. Secrets spilled from lips without her asking. Some tried to fight it. Others tried to run. One family left Chaya entirely, claiming the girl had cursed their dreams. But the father returned weeks later, mad, barefoot, eyes wild. She followed. "Me," he whispered, "even in the city. She was in the mirror. She was in my wife's voice. She was in my sleep." He never left again. Just sat on a stool in the corner of the square, muttering Noria's name like a prayer and a curse tangled together. But the one who worried most wasn't the villagers. It was Mbuya Dine. She watched her granddaughter drift further from the girl she once was. There were moments Noria would sit by the fire, staring into the flames for hours, not blinking. Her skin was cooler now, her heartbeat softer, her gaze not human. One night the old woman asked her something no one else dared to say. "Do you want to be saved?" Noria didn't blink, didn't flinch, but the room got colder. Mbuya Dene leaned closer. "The red one gave you silence, but he didn't. Say what happens if you enjoy it too much." Still no answer. The next day 3 women approached the shrine. They carried bundles of cloth and baskets of yams as offerings. They knelt at Noria's feet, eyes cast low. "Please," the oldest whispered, "judge our men." Noria frowned. The woman lifted her head. "They beat us. They lie. They steal. The council protects them. But you see truth. Let your silence speak." It wasn't a question. It was worship. Noria stood still for a long moment, then turned and walked away. But that night, 2 of those men were found, sobbing and shaking. One clawing at his own throat, the other begging forgiveness from trees, ants, the moon. Anything that would listen. The village got its message. From that day they stopped calling her Noria. They called her the mouthless one. She who hears the sins, the silent judge, and she let them. Because something inside her had shifted. She no longer craved her voice. She craved truth. She fed on it, lived in it. Every time someone's guilt exploded into the open, she felt stronger, clearer, more alive than when she was loud. But power is never quiet forever, and not everyone bowed. One night, a new man came, into Chaya, dressed simple, eyes sharp, a traveler, a griot, he claimed, a storyteller from the eastern hills. He'd heard rumors of the silent girl and wanted to witness her for himself. He met her near the riverbank where she now spent long hours simply being. "You listen well," he said. "But do you still feel?" Noria said nothing. He sat beside her, unafraid. "I've met many with power," he continued. "Curses, spirits, gods. But the ones who scared me most weren't those who couldn't speak. They were the ones who stopped needing to." Noria finally turned her head, slowly, He smiled, but there was no fear in his eyes. "You think silence is peace," he said softly. "But it can become a prison, and sometimes it becomes a weapon too heavy to carry." That night, for the first time in weeks, Noria dreamed, not of thorns, not of screaming. She dreamed of herself, alone in a stone room with no windows, a crown of silence on her head, and 100 mouths crying around her, but hers still sealed shut. The man in red stood outside the door, watching. "Ready for your next lesson?" he whispered. The traveler stayed. He didn't leave the next morning like most outsiders did after catching one glimpse of Noria's eyes. He lingered, asked questions in the market, listened to the villagers' whispers, watched Noria from a careful distance. His name was Omari, and he carried no weapons, just a carved wooden flute and a book with no words. He spoke softly, smiled often, but his eyes were always working. It wasn't long before people started avoiding him too. "Be careful," the cloth dyer whispered. "He speaks too freely." "He laughs at the wrong things," the baker added. "He said maybe we need less. Silence, not more." One woman even said she saw him standing near the grove at night talking to himself, or to someone unseen. Omar didn't seem to mind the distance. He didn't worship Noria like the others, didn't bow. But he didn't insult her either. He simply existed in her world, like he was waiting. And that's what made him dangerous. Because on the 5th night of his stay, he played the flute outside her hut, a soft, humming tune, haunting, aching, almost sad. It wasn't a song of rebellion, it was a question. And Noria heard it. She stepped outside. He didn't stop playing, just looked up, eyes glowing faint in the moonlight. When the final note faded, he asked her one thing. "If you could speak, what would you say first?" She didn't answer. Couldn't, but something flickered in her chest. "I've seen men who use silence to rule," he continued. "I've seen women who turn it into a knife, but you wear it like a crown." He stood slowly. "The man in red gave you that crown. But tell me, did you ever ask why he gave it to you?" She stared at him, gold swirling quietly in her. "Irises, I think," Omari said. "He wanted to see what happens when truth has no mouth. Only echoes." Noria didn't move, but later that night, alone, she stared at the old mirror again. Her face had returned, just barely, like fog lifting from a pond. Her voice still didn't work, but something inside her was changing, and that terrified her, because power had become comfort. But now, she missed her voice. Not the insults, not the sharp edges, just the ability to say something soft, something real. Like "I'm sorry," like "I'm afraid," like "thank you." But she couldn't. Not yet. That's when she noticed it. The silence around her wasn't still anymore. It pulsed, it breathed, it had hunger. Every truth, every confession the villagers made, every breakdown, every prayer muttered under pressure. It was feeding something, and it wasn't her. It was him, the man in red, still inside her, still watching through her silence, still growing. Omar was right. She hadn't been given power. She'd been made into a vessel, a doorway, and the final. Doctor was opening. That same night, Omari knocked at her hut. No one had ever done that since her voice vanished. He stepped in without waiting. "I think you know now," he said, "what he is." She nodded, slowly. Her body trembled. Omari placed his flute down. "I came here not to destroy you, but to remind you." He opened the book with no words, and suddenly they were there, words glowing across the page like fireflies, names. "Memories, truths, not hers, not Chaya's, his, the man in red. His name was once Kalemba," Omari said, "a speaker of truth centuries ago, a preacher, a liberator, until his own pride devoured him. He demanded silence to rule, and the gods made it eternal." He looked at her, gently, sadly, "And now he seeks to return, through you." Noria shook her head. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks. "You still have one choice," Omari said, "but it will cost you everything." She looked at the book, at her trembling hands, At the village outside, quiet, broken, bleeding truth like water, and she realized the silence wasn't peace anymore. It was a cage, and she was the door. She sat by the fire for a long time, staring into the pages of Omare's glowing book. The words burned her eyes, not because they were lies, but because they were too real. Kalemba, the man in red, the one who had once been human, once used his voice to raise the poor, once demanded justice, once craved praise, until the gods silenced him, not out of punishment but mercy, and now he lived in her, his whispers woven into her thoughts, his hunger curled around her bones. All this time she thought she was wielding power, but power had been wearing her. Omare knelt beside her, flute in his lap, book open like a wound. "You can end it," he said, "but you'll have to give up everything." She knew what he meant. The silence that had once crushed her had become her shelter, her safety, her identity. Without it, who was she? Just a girl with a sharp tongue. And too many regrets? The village would never look at her the same. They'd fear her, or worse, and they'd forget her. She stood slowly. The wind outside shifted. The kind of wind that only came before change, or destruction. Outside people gathered, silent, uninvited. Drawn to her hut by something they couldn't name. The sky above Chaya was a deep purple now. No stars, no moon. Just pressure. Heavy and trembling, they saw her step out with the book in her hands. No words were spoken. They watched her walk to the old shrine. Omare followed, his flute held like a blade. Mbuya Dene limped behind, whispering a prayer to a god she no longer trusted. At the shrine she placed the book on the stone. It hissed like something alive. A voice, his voice, coiled around the crowd. Low and deep and almost loving. "You called me," it said, "from every shadow, every tree. How you wore my silence. You judged in my name. Why stop now?" The wind rose, the trees bent, the earth cracked just slightly beneath her feet. Noria closed her eyes, and for the first time in 33 days, she spoke, a single word. Broken. Croaked. Shaking. Enough. The silence shattered like glass. A rush of air burst from her chest. The villagers stumbled back, covering their ears as if the word itself had weight. Kalemba screamed, not in pain, but in fury. "You fool! You needed me. Without me you are nothing." Noria opened the book again, and this time she spoke every word inside it out loud. Name by name, sin by sin, truth by truth. Each word peeled Kalemba from her spirit like bark from an old tree. He roared and twisted, appearing in flashes, a shadowy figure of fire and grief, his mouth sealed with golden thread, eyes burning with rage. But with every name she spoke, he shrank, until he was just a whisper again. And then, nothing. The wind stopped. The fire died, and the night was just night again. Noria fell to her knees. Her voice was back, but her power was gone. The crowd stepped back, uncertain, confused. They had worshipped her silence. What were they supposed to do with her voice? Omare placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said. She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "It's just beginning." Because now she had to live without the silence. No crown, no curse, just her and the truth. The real truth. She wasn't a judge. She wasn't a spirit. She was just a girl who had hurt people. And learned. In the weeks that followed, the village of Chaya began to heal, not because Noria punished people, but because she forgave them. She spoke carefully now, listened more than ever, and whenever someone came to her with a lie, trembling, on their lips she didn't silence them. She just looked them in the eyes and said softly, "I've been there. Don't let silence be your cage," and sometimes that was enough. As for Omare, he left one morning before sunrise, his flute quiet, his book blank once more. But before he disappeared into the hills, he turned and smiled at her one last time. "You gave up power," he said, "to become human again." She smiled back. "I never stopped being human," she said. "I just forgot how to be small."